Hi, I'm Mike Kessler.
And I'm Krista Kessler, and we would like to tell you our testimony about our daughter Emily Grace Kessler. In June of 2014, I found out that I was pregnant, and which was a surprise. We have our oldest son is Jonathan, and our middle daughter is Elizabeth. And so we were excited to add our third child. In July of that year, I started to bleed, and we thought that we were having a miscarriage. And so we went to the emergency room, and they did an ultrasound and told us that there was no heartbeat, and that she was also only 7 weeks along when she should have been 9 weeks. We went home that weekend, and I started contacting all of my friends and just asking them to pray for us and to pray for the baby. We didn't know exactly, what was going to happen, but we had a follow-up appointment with our doctor on that Monday. We went in, and they wanted to do another ultrasound just to make sure that the findings on the original one were correct. So we went in, and the tech started the procedure, and she was asking us questions, how far along did they say that you were? We told her, gave her all the information, and she said, I'm finding that you are 9 weeks along and there is a heartbeat. So she turned the machine on, and we heard the most glorious sound was this baby's heartbeat. So fast forward, typical pregnancy, aches, pains. We get to February 2nd, and they were going to induce me. We got a call from the hospital saying that they were very busy and that they were short-staffed, and they wanted me to come in on February 3rd. So very disappointed because we were anxiously, waiting to see our new bundle of joy. And so we went in on February 3rd, and I was induced, and typical labor all day. Then finally around hour 17 is when things took a turn and got quite scary for both me and for the baby.
I remember we were having a conversation and just joking around all day as we were waiting, and pretty excited, and they kept adding more and more Pitocin to help Krista dilate so that way we could finally meet baby Kessler. And I remember it was just about, it's just before 1 a.m. and I was talking to Krista, and she just closed her eyes, and I was saying, Krista, and she wasn't responding, and I looked down at the sheet, and there was just a pool of blood. And so I called the nurse in, and they pulled back the sheet, and it was the most scary sight I'd ever seen. And they said, we've got to take her in right now, something's wrong. And they wheeled her through, and they pushed her through into the OR, and I was standing outside the OR doors with just me and my mother-in-law Karen, and we were just watching helplessly, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what was going on. I had no idea. And I just put a post out on Facebook and said, small problem, God's already working it out. And so we waited outside the door for a good bit of time, and finally the doctor came out and said, I've got some news for you. Krista's okay, but she's lost a lot of blood, and your baby girl was born at 1:04 a.m., but she has no brain activity. She was unresponsive, and she went approximately 23 minutes with no oxygen. And they said, we need some decisions, and you need to make them now. What would you like us to do? We can send her over to Altman Hospital and do a new type of cooling therapy that is shown to help, but it's a 50-50 shot if she'll survive. And there's no guarantees, but we need a decision right now because there's protocols. So I gave the authorization. I hadn't even met her yet. I had no idea what was going on with Krista. And so I gave the authorization without Krista, to send her over to Altman. And when I went in, they let me see her before they loaded her up in the ambulance. And there was just a body. I mean, there was Emily was not moving, not crying, not doing anything. She was just there. And they said that she had a pulse, but she was not breathing on her own, and no response to stimulation. And so I went back out and just began to worry. I had no idea what to do. I was just in the midst of this storm with no guidance. My faith was definitely being tested, and meanwhile, while I'm in the hallway thinking of all this is happening and what could potentially happen, Krista was having a little bit of a different experience.
Having grown up in the church, faith was a big part of my life. And so even though we didn't know, what was going to happen with her, I knew that only good could come out of it. And so I started praying, and through my hospital stay, I would, read scriptures. People would send me scriptures. I would listen to praise music, and just anything that I could do to help make it through, because I was at the hospital. I wasn't alone, but Mike was trying to spend time with me, but also spend time with Emily, since we were at two different hospitals. And so finally, when I was able to get out of the hospital, which was 3 or 4 days later, my first stop was to the Altman NICU to go and see my baby.
And that night, after she was born, it was about 4 a.m., and the doctor came out and said, Krista's stable. We were able to stabilize her, but she's lost a lot of blood, and the recovery time is going to be pretty significant. And as you just heard, the first miracle is she was out of that hospital. And we went 2 different hospitals. Emily was born at would have been Timken Mercy at the time, and just 3 days later, Krista is out of the hospital. But I remember going home that night and feeling helpless. I did not grow up in the church. In fact, I started going to church because Krista's parents said that if I wanted to date their daughter, I had to be a Christian. So I thought, well, one church service on Sunday was definitely worth the other 6 days with their daughter. And so, but I went home that night, and with this faith that was still maturing, and I Googled what the doctor told me was her diagnosis, which was HIE. And it was essentially just a lack of oxygen to the brain. And when I Googled, the first thing that came up was that in nearly 100% of cases, it was fatal. And if not fatal right away, fatal soon thereafter. And in all of my earnest, I just lifted up a prayer that my daughter would pass away. I didn't want to go through that trial of having this happen and having to experience the death of a daughter that I would grow to love. And those of you that obviously have seen Emily around the church know that God did not honor that prayer. And I'm so thankful, because this was about to start the trial that would help me have a mature faith like Krista's. So while Krista was over at Mercy, I would go over to Altman and I would grab my little girl's hand, and she was still non-responsive that first morning. And I would just wrap her fingers around my finger and would just tell her how much I loved her, and just tell her that I was praying and that I would hope things would that she would be better. I really had no idea. I had no idea what to do. It was just a child-like faith, which I guess is a great thing. And so I would relay messages back and forth to Krista about what was going on in the hospital. I would take pictures, and this was, this first day. And so I went back the second day, and when I walked into the hospital, and there was no brain activity still on first day. She was on the cooling therapy. And when I went back in the second day, I reached down to grab her fingers just to wrap them around mine, I think more for my comfort than hers. And she jumped, her arm moved, And I ran out of the room and I said to the nurse, I said, her arm moved. She responded to me touching her, which was the first response to stimulus. And the nurse said, I'm sorry that I didn't catch you. Overnight, her brain activity kicked on. And she's had constant brain activity all since overnight. It's pretty awesome to see that this daughter was beginning the transformation of her healing, that she was having brain activity. She was responding to stimulus. She was beginning this healing process. And so this went on for the cooling therapy for 3 days. And they called us, it was a Saturday, and they said, hey, after 72 hours, we're going to begin to warm her body back up. And we'll know at this point if she's going to make it, if she's going to survive this treatment. And so we sat by the phone all day that Saturday waiting. Every time the phone rang, we would just jump just to see, was this the hospital? Was this the hospital? And the process would take 24 hours. And at the end of the cooling therapy, we got a call, and that they said she did wonderful and she made it through the whole process seizure-free, and that she pulled through. So we settled up at the Altman NICU we really had no idea how long the stay was, and we began to meet some of the families in the NICU, many of the caregivers, and it was interesting. In fact, one of our own, Terry Millard, was her dietitian, and we didn't know Terry. We weren't attending Woodlawn at the time. And one by one, we found out that nearly all of the caregivers that were taking care of our Emily were Christian. And they were very bold about their faith and would tell us about them praying for Emily and praying for us. And once again, we didn't know how long that this was going to be in the NICU. The one family had been there about 100 days. And so we weren't sure what to expect. And so our NICU experience was really began this journey of faith building. Every day there would be new successes, new things that we would see happening, whether it was upping her feed or reducing her oxygen. And I remember it was probably day 6 or day 7 that we came in and all of the machines in her room were gone. And what a glorious feeling when all she had was a nasal cannula and just a tube coming in her mouth. And my faith was still being developed, but how are you feeling during all this?
Well, just seeing all of these small miracles happening every time that we went in, we would be able to share those miracles with the other families in the NICU, people outside of the hospital. I know that the Lord would heal Emily. And I know that he has the ability to do it all at once, but if he did that, then we would miss out on all of these small miracles happening every day in her life. The fact that she's now a second grader and uses a talker, to be able to communicate, our prayer was always, that she would be able to speak. She may not do it the traditional way, but, using this communication device, she's able to tell us, that she can tell a joke with her communication device. She can tell us that she has to use the bathroom with her communication device.
Yeah, I remember when she first got the device, I was so excited about her first words, and they bring the device home, and I'm like, Emily, you gotta tell me, I want to hear you talk. I want to hear your first words. And at this point, she's 7. So, many of you get first words at 10 months or a year or whatever that is. It's 7 years old, and I've been waiting for these first words. And her first words, never forget them. It was just inspiring because she told me, stop. She said, stop. That was her first words. And so I didn't get that, like dad or mom or love you. I got stop. But this progression of this orneriness and this sense of humor and her fitting in with our family, really began in the NICU, and it wasn't just we saw miracles every day. I mean, we saw constant miracles, and but we saw ups and downs. 2 bouts of pneumonia in the NICU, where all of a sudden she's aspirating, she's got fluid in her lungs. They're trying to figure out what's going on. They can't up her feeds. They're not sure if she's going to sustain. Just this constant up and down. That people say you have these hills and valleys, and I just felt like we were on a roller coaster. Every day was, knew this, knew that. And we were sharing our story through Facebook every day. This was a good outlet for us to be able to capture our thoughts, and we knew that down the road it would be good for us to go back and look and experience from a different perspective what was happening. And so we would share these, and then all of a sudden we began to get messages from people all over the United States that said, we're praying for Emily, people we didn't know. And I remember one in particular where someone came to know Christ through this story. And Krista had written a letter to Emily on Facebook during this time. And, I know it'd be a little tough, but you could share a little bit about that letter.
That, that going through this difficult time and this trial, if one person were to come to Jesus, then it makes it all worth it.
And so this was, the mindset, and, noticeably Krista's faith inspired me to have a stronger faith, to be able to endure this and to see the way that Krista was living out this trial. And, in my humanness, I was just looking for reasons, looking for explanations. And I remember, one day in particular, we had gone from Altman up to University Hospitals, and she was going to have a G-tube put in so she could feed through a tube that would allow her to sustain life. And as we were going through, an environmental service worker came in and was sweeping the room and asked, how we were doing. And I said, we're trying to figure it all out. We're trying to put all the pieces together. And she said, do you mind if I pray for you? And this is not a Catholic hospital, not a Christian hospital. This is, a major hospital in Cleveland. And I told my wife, I said, this truly is an amazing place. And if I ever get the opportunity, I would love to work for university hospitals. And, be careful what you wish for. 2 jobs later, I now work for university hospitals, helping develop the very caregivers that took care of our Emily at the hospital. And so after UH, we came back to Altman, and we were progressing along, but the one question we never had answered was the results of the MRI. And that was really weighing on our heart. We wanted to know what was the long-term damage. And in my mind, looking back, maybe foolish, but I had taken Emily and had believed to some aspect that she would have a full healing, that she would come out of the hospital. I don't know what I was expecting, like a normal baby. We would have a normal life. And Krista and I remember the day, it was somewhere around day 40, and finally Dr. Ford came into the room, and I said, hey doc, can we talk about the MRI? I just want to know what's going on. And she said, well, let's have this conversation. She said, Emily's has significant brain damage. Her brain looks like Swiss cheese. There's dead spots all throughout her brain. And I said, so what's that mean then? Just going to take a little bit more time before she, walks, talks. And she says, Mike, I have to tell you, Emily will not be normal. You have to reset your expectations here. And I remember at that point having that breakdown, right? This is the kind of the faith journey, is where, you go from this and then you begin to believing that this is going to be some miraculous healing, and that all of a sudden this is going to happen, and it didn't happen that way. And so once again, in this developing faith, I felt crushed to know. And Dr. Ford had said to us, I'm glad to see you finally having a cry, finally having some sort of adverse emotion, because we didn't believe that you were in reality. You were handling this so well. And so it was that was an interesting time, and we reset our expectation. And right around that same time, we talked about that it would be pretty cool when, you see people like leaving the tunnel after the big game, and they got people on the sidelines doing the high fives and highlighting. And we were always joking with them that it would be cool, like when the families leave the NICU, if you do the high fives down the hallway, just joking around. And day 41, we finally we were discharged. And Krista, right before we got discharged, she said she was fitting Emily in the car seat, and they said, well, I think this should be able to be in here about 20 minutes. And Krista said, that's perfect, because that's how long it takes to get to Target and then back from Target. So they had their Target run planned and her new Target partner. But we got to leave that day, and it was St. Patrick's Day, 41 days in, and they said, hey, it's time to go home. And we looked out the door, and there were all of our caregivers just lined up down the hallway and ready to give us high fives as we exited the NICU, and then began this journey of being home, of what this new life would look like. And there was certainly challenges to come. Krista at that point, she was working and transitioned to be a stay-at-home mom. We weren't financially ready for that, so she had transitioned to be a stay-at-home mom, and both of our kids, a 10-year-old and a 5-year-old, we had to figure out what new life looked like for them. And I think part of the challenge is that we try to figure all of this out. And when you try to figure it all out, you take faith out of the equation. And it was so overwhelming that we couldn't figure it out. It wasn't something that we could figure out in our humanness. It wasn't anything. We had to rely on God to see us through this.
Well, and even, during the transition phase from Altman to Cleveland, our church at the time, they had set up kind of like a meal train where people would bring food over every night for us. And when we ended up having to drive to Cleveland every day, there was about 10 days that we did that, we had asked them not to bring food just because we wouldn't be home. And so one night we were on our way home from Cleveland, and we were both starving, and Mike made the comment, he was like, man, it'd be nice to come home and have a meal,
It does get easy. I mean, we really got used to that. We kind of got, know.
And so it just so happened that Chick-fil-A was open, and we were getting ready to pass one, so we pulled in there and we ordered at the drive-thru, and we get up to the window, and Mike is ready to give them the money, and the worker said, you don't have to pay, the car in front of you paid. And so it was just God, just showing off again, saying, hey, even though you're making this trek back and forth, I still have your meals planned for you. So it's just those little God moments that we could see things happen like that all the time, and just him showing us his promise of always being there for us.
Yeah, and we experienced this in multiple ways. The verse of the day, I don't know how many people use the Bible app, but the verse of the day that day, the day that she was born, said, don't worry about anything, don't be anxious. And then your devotional had a similar message on that day. And we just saw God working things out. At the time I was working in retail, and I traveled for a living. I was going, 5 days a week. I worked on Saturdays. Sunday was my only day off, and my boss said, listen, work from the hospital. You don't have to worry about it. For 41 days I worked from the hospital. What a blessing. I mean, unheard of in this happening. And then the people that surrounded her, the caregivers that could that just help us. We found out one of our caregivers, Trisha in particular, when we moved into our new house 4 years ago, she lived right up the road. And so we had this built-in, go-to to help us. And at every step of the way, God was there, in every trial. And sometimes it was hard. Sometimes we got clouded by the trial, and we looked in front of us and said, we just can't see, at least that was for me. But when we focused, God was there. His hand was in every little element of it. I mean, even at that time, I think the hospital expenses were $1.2 million. And it was out of network at the time for my insurance, and they said, hey, you owe $38,000. And I told Krista, I said, it's going to be a while before she's ours. and lo and behold, we got a letter that because of her condition, the balance was picked up. We paid nothing. We had $1.2 million that was taken care of for, this. And I mean, and all of these burdens that he walked through us along the way. And so now, as Krista mentioned, those of you that have met Emily know that she is far from brain dead. That one day brain dead little girl, she is ornery and she's defiant and she is brilliant. She gets good grades all the time, in reading and math. And she's, in a classroom that is a blended classroom. And she just continues to amaze us in what she does. Even from turning on the TV, Krista's dad was over the other day to help her get on the bus. We had an award ceremony for Jonathan, and her dad couldn't figure out the TV. And so he asked Emily, is this the remote to turn the TV? And she said, no. And he held up a second remote and she said, no. And then the third remote and she said, yes. And so the way that she communicates and the signs that she does, whether it's pick me up or she wants to see Rosie, and she makes up signs for everyone. And so that's super exciting. And I know for you and me, but you in particular, we've often talked about praise. What does praise look like for Emily? And, what's going to be her calling in life? And we're both eager to see that. And I know that you spoke with her about the gospel, and it was awesome.
Yeah, I asked Emily where Jesus is, and she pointed to her heart, and then she pointed to her head. Hey, Emily. Hey, Ems, look at Mama. Hey. Where is Jesus? Where's Jesus? In your heart. Very good. Oh, and in your mind too. Good job. So she knows even at this age that Jesus is in her heart. And I truly believe that he's been with her every step of the way. And he's had his hand on her. And I know that he will continue to have his hand on her.
Yeah, this journey is not the choice we would have made at the time it happened, but we're just extremely grateful that God has chosen us to speak this testimony, that God has chosen us to have this walk, and we can only give him all the glory for everything that's happened in her life.